Ngani pamoja, kauli mbiu moja, wakati ni sasa. Vuta dada, mama msilale, wakati wetu umefika, wanawake msilale. Vuta dada, vijana msilale, wakati wetu umefika, Wakenya msilale.
I will paraphrase what she said, ethnic mobilization. Are you able to mobilize a large group from your regional background? Number two, finances. How much are you bringing? And the tickets have prices. Nominations have actual prices. And number three was what she alluded to, which women are specifically very often asked for, that is not asked of men. I think you can fill in that blank yourself. So when we talk about financing elections, we're not just talking about the actual financing, the payments that have to be made by each of the participants of an election. It's all of the other costs that come with that. And how do we ensure that we create a more level playing field so that women, persons with disabilities, minorities, persons who do not have money or do not have as much money can also participate? Because when we exclude by version of financing, then we ensure that at the ballot box, the choices are limited to only those who are rich and well-to-do, which of course is not reflective of the country that we're in. The conversation now coming up is about financing elections, status, approaches, and strategies. I want to remind us all of just the rules of engagement. Please keep your questions very short, brief, to the point. Type as many as you can in the chat for those who are in the regions so that we can pick them up and distribute them. And also make sure that you have addressed your question to the person who you would most like for it to be answered by. I want to introduce onto the stage our moderator, who, as you know from yesterday, the Justice retired Violet Mavisi, who will introduce her panel. Karibu. Thank you so much. Excellent. Youth favors you.
Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to this session. I have a team of very powerful speakers who are going to talk to us about financing elections, the status, the approaches, the strategies, and they'll even look at the challenges that we are facing as we move forward. Just following up what the MC has said, that really we need to make sure that we have a level playing field, especially when it comes to elections. And the first speaker I will introduce, and please come to the podium as we speak, is Sheila Masinde. Sheila has, as I introduce you, please. Sheila has 18 years work experience in media outreach, governance, and program management. And she's currently the Executive Director of Transparency International, Kenya TI. I think we always look forward to your reports. Having served as Program Manager, Head of Programs between 2015 and 2020, and she joined TI Kenya in 2014 as the Research and Learning Manager. Sheila. Yeah, because the space here for somebody to move.
Okay. So go to the first one.
Yeah, just go to the first one. Oh. We are 4. So the next one. Research Manager from BBC Media Action, and where she was the Communication and Training Manager. She first worked for Transparency International from 2009 to 2012 as the Advocacy and Communications Program Officer. And then she also has worked at the Nation Media Group as a radio news presenter and online sub-editor. Transparency International, as you all know, is a non-profit organization and an autonomous chapter of the Transparency International movement, a global coalition against corruption. And TI's vision is that of a corrupt-free Kenya. And TI has been at the forefront of the fight against corruption and governance reforms, supporting citizens, public institutions, and the private sector to effect transparency and accountability since 1999. Please help me just to appreciate Sheila for coming to join us, and welcome. The next person I want to introduce, and who is a good friend of mine, is Dr. Pauline Sadotte, senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi. Pauline, karibu. And Dr. Sadotte is a lawyer and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He has a PhD in law from the University of Nairobi, and he is currently the Associate Dean at the Faculty of Law and Research Director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Environmental Law, CASLED, at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Pauline Sadotte has refused to tell us he has done a lot of work around issues of elections as a trainer and as an author. Yeah. So welcome, and please let us appreciate Dr. Pauline Sadotte for taking time to be with us. And please don't move the seats behind. You might just fall. So as you sit down, don't push it. Just leave it where it is. Well, we don't, as Winnie said in the morning, we don't want to take you to the hospital. And we don't want to stop our meeting right now to take you to the hospital. So thank you very much for reminding me. The third person we want to invite onto the podium is Mule Musau. And where is he? Where is Mule? Oh, he's behind me. Karibu sana, and as he comes to the podium, please, can we invite him with a round of applause? Mule, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. He's the National Coordinator of Election Observation Group, ELOG, as well as the Regional Coordinator for the East and the Horn of Africa Elections Observation Network, which brings together citizen observation platforms in the Eastern African region. He has experience in electoral governance spanning over 15 years, so we know we are in good hands. During which he has participated in electoral processes in several countries, including Ghana, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Indonesia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. During this time, he has worked and consulted variously in the International Peace and Support Center, the Carter Center, the National Democratic Institute, ASA, and Conrad Adno, among others. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll share with us your experiences from other regions as we talk about election, financing elections. Last but not least is Kwame Owino. Where's Kwame? Oh, he's there. Please welcome him. And Kwame Owino is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's a think tank that carries out research and public dialogue on public affairs affecting Kenya and the region. Prior to taking the present office in 2013, he was a program officer responsible for research and policy dialogue on topical issues in Kenya's economy, together with specific work on economic regulation. His main research interest includes applied economic analysis, public economics, and regional integration, in addition to all areas of public affairs in which the application of futures thinking is applicable. So you're the money man. So you'll help us think around the numbers, I hope so. So you're all welcome to this session. Those who are with the various sites, please make sure you can write your question, but we will be giving, because of lack of time, unfortunately, even for you, I'll just be giving you 5 minutes on the areas that we will ask you to look at. Let me start off with Dr. Collins Sadotte. We had the election, was it Campaign Financing Act, passed in 2013? And then somewhere along the way it was suspended and said, okay, we won't do it for the 2017. But right now, it's supposed to operate in the 2022 elections. I think sometimes in July, we had IEBC chair coming out and saying, we are going to operationalize this act and ensure that we cap what can be spent on campaigns and in elections in general. And we have seen a lot of opposition, at least some of it from the members of the public. But we need to make this space at least equal in terms of financing. From where you sit and from the work you have carried out, what are the issues around campaign financing? Why don't we want to have that cap? And what can we do to ensure that public office, people who are candidates actually adhere to the issue of limiting themselves to what is supposed to be used for elections? And are we able to ensure free and fair elections with the kind of finances that have been set?
Thank you very much, Violet, and good morning, everybody. Reflecting upon your question, I think just last week I was watching TV and there was a debate about the campaign finance regulations, and one of the people I saw on TV was a member of parliament who will remain nameless. I remember him because this is his first term. When he came in, he said, I didn't have money, I struggled to convince the people, I was popular, so I just walked around. This time he was saying, for you to be a member of parliament, you actually require around 50 million shillings to campaign. 5 years. So 5 years ago, he didn't have money and he was very happy that he won. Now he says you can't win unless you have 50 million. That's the answer to why the law cannot be passed. Because every incumbent member of parliament knows the influence of money on their elections, and they want an unfair playing field. They want that money to be available only to them. They want to get it from very strange sources, and they don't want somebody to ask the question. If you look at literature around election campaign finance, you'll find that the reason why we have election campaign finance is to try and avoid 4 things. Number 1 is to try and avoid an uneven playing field. Where Kwame and myself are running, I have 10 million, Kwame has 100 million. And the decision as to whether Kwame wins or myself wins is dependent by the amount of money we have. So yes, we are both campaigning, we both have money, but the playing field is not even. That's the first reason. The second reason is to ensure that there's equal access to office. There's one thing about a playing field, there's another about equal access to office. And the second one actually affects women and youth much more. That there are certain segments of society who will not ever access that office because they don't have the money. So if we say from what, and Joyce is here, that IBC says you require X, let's say 80 million to run some place. So if you don't have 80 million, it means you cannot vie. Because the moment I see the amounts of money that is being required, the moment I don't have it, I can't just vie. So I will never be able to seek that office. But the third is to avoid having surrogate politicians. The people who are not politicians, but they make the decisions. He who pays the piper calls the tune. So you are busy lobbying, and I see many of us here who lobby for different laws, but there's somebody who says this law will never be passed. Or the CS Treasury is doing some gazette notice about which bank is being exempted, and the decision about that is not made by what is good for the country. It's made by who paid several years ago, because that money must be recovered. And the fourth is to avoid having corrupt politics and politicians, where the people who run, and I think the best example is if you go to countries where you have drug lords. So you have the people who are running your politics to be the unfair people. And that for me was the rationale behind our election campaign financing process. But the politics of it is what's made life difficult. And let me tell you why the politics made life difficult. I think we are talking about the law was suspended, we need the law to come into effect. But Violet, we're just coming from a point where the Court of Appeal has told us that the Constitution is alive. Today is the 11th anniversary of the 2010 Constitution. That 2010 Constitution says that IEBC is supposed to regulate the amount of money that is used in our politics. So there's nothing about coming into force. There's nothing about the regulations are yet to come into force. The amount of money is supposed to be regulated. My biggest problem, though, is that we have over-focused on limits and not on disclosure. I had, for example, my very good friend Irungu Houghton is saying, you know, we need that a woman needs 22.8 million, which is more than a man. So we need to think about reducing the amount of money. But I think that's the smaller problem. Because once you say it is 80, if I don't have 80, I won't run. I think the bigger issue is we need to ask ourselves, for the 22.8 million, what are we using it for? Are those uses legitimate? Number two, and something I'm hoping Kwame will talk about from a balance sheet perspective, does it match with what you get? Because if I run for office and I'm using 80 million, but over the 5 years I will get 20 million. So it means I'm using 60 more than what I will get. Where is this 60 coming from? It must be from some corrupt practices. And in my view, I think there are several things we need to do in terms of ensuring that we address the issue about campaign financing. I think the first is there is need for Sheila and the rest of us to focus much more on following the money, to start asking where is this money coming from, what is it used. I remember in 2002, there was a coalition on accountable public financing that followed that followed where the money was being used, and I think a very huge and good report was done. Over the last 18 years, we have dropped the ball. We just focus too much on the law coming into force. We don't do practical things. Kwame and myself are on an accountability network. Yesterday, there was a conversation on that network that seems to be glorifying corruption in politics. I think we need to be able to call out and say, if people are spending much more money than they earn, they actually must be getting this money corruptly. They are corrupting our politics, and as a consequence, we will never have a clean election. For the women of this country, I think there are several things also that we need to do. If you look at the Political Parties Act, the Political Parties Act says, you know, the money that political parties are given. And if I go back to the history of the Political Parties Act, I picked a document that was worked on by CGD in 2002. Very early on. When the Political Parties Act was being enacted, the main reason was to actually address public funding of parties. The main reason. So therefore, the provisions that exist in that act saying that 30% is supposed to be used to promote the nominations and campaigns for women should not just be something written, but that is not implemented. We need to be much more innovative, because in reality, if you ask the main parties, and I think the current main parties that get the Political Parties Act is Jubilee and ODM. If you ask them, what have you used with your 30% in terms of encouraging the participation of women? I think the answer you will get is some report, but nothing in practice. I want to challenge FIDA to ask themselves, have we followed to find out what is this money being used for? The second, I think it's important that the agencies that are responsible for enforcement, that's IEBC, that's the police, do their work much more effective. And lastly, I think it's important that public interest citizens must be able to engage the judiciary in terms of public interest litigation, so that we can be able to call out and ensure that there's much more hygiene in terms of the use of our politics. That requires we focus, in my view, less on limits and more on disclosure. Thank you, Violet.
Oh, thank you very much. We should focus our eyes on what? On disclosure. Where is this money coming from? And how are you supposed to be recovering this money if you're using so much money? And I think I'm going to Kwame, because Collins has already alluded to that question. And he has asked you, and in a way, roundabout way, this campaign finance capping by IEBC. And we have seen the figures. For presidential election, I think is about how much? 4 billion? Something like that. For women rep is about 20 million. And from what is it? For member of parliament is about 16 million. And the figures are mind-boggling. In fact, I was telling Collins today, my daughter asked me if the president is going to use 4 billion to campaign, what is in it? So I'm asking you, from an income and expenditure perspective, because those are the figures you look at every day, what does this translate in terms of issues of good governance, in terms of issues of level of playing field? What does it translate to? Are we really going to ensure there's good governance? If at all, I can spend so much money and my salary in the next 5 years will not even come to even a quarter of what I have spent.
Okay, let's just go back and start from the rationale. And we start with the view that the aim, I actually think this law has the wrong name. Yes, because it's supposed to be basically campaign finance limits, right? Which is supposed to be about the limits of campaign finance. But if we start with the rationale, I will say something that's a bit controversial. I don't see the argument that campaign finance tilts advantages to those who have money, unless we are claiming that the only reason Kenyans get up at 3 a.m., line up for 2 hours to vote, is because they've been paid. That's a huge assumption. So that our politics is entirely determined, or rather political outcomes are entirely determined by who paid what amount. And I don't think that statement is irrefutable. It's not always true. So what's the public interest that should come? I actually think that the rationale that Dr. Dote gave, the third one, which is basically the transparency of the expenditure and the sources of income of whoever is contesting of elections, is far more important than actually trying to limit it. So the capping of that law, I'm not too sure is necessarily consistent with public interest. Because I'll tell you what will happen. So they'll tell you that this is what we've capped, and then instead what they'll do is have their supporters and all those people on the background buy the goods and services that are required to generate your support without necessarily. So what it does is artificial capping will necessarily just introduce cheating by someone saying that, look, I kept it below the 80 million, but actually you're spending in other ways. So is it good use of public sector time to ask the IEBC to even monitor those? I don't think so. Because in my view, it's a distraction for the IEBC, which so far has shown us that it's incapable of administering an election of 16 million people and giving us a perfect result. So even before you go to the economics, my view is that I would not trip myself in my clothes if there was no campaign financing caps in Kenya. What would I insist on? The transparency and the sources. So that's one. The second point is this. If you think that campaign financing necessarily means that only rich people should contest, I think we must not make the assumption that if a member of parliament earns $1 million, so over 5 years, he's earned 60. And if he spent 100 million, then it means that the rest will actually come from corrupt purposes. There are people, not necessarily Kenyans, but there are people who are philanthropic in other parts of the world, and they actually tend to come into the public service for the purposes of service. So they actually deploy their own resources to make sure they are. And we can mention them. Mayor Bloomberg, for instance, a person who actually had a public sector, a private sector job, then dedicated that to being elected for leadership in New York and did a fairly decent job some 10 years ago or so. So my view is that I trust people. I trust human beings, provided systems exist. So the point that we need to show is that the disclosures are important for the purposes of ensuring that, one, you're not receiving laundered money, and two, you're not directing money or rather promising people who fund a campaign that they will have access to public sector funds. And that need not necessarily be fixed through campaign financing caps. I actually think that the things that deter Kenyan women from running for elections are not money. The general disorder within political parties, and sometimes the violence and the unfair behavior that prevents women from actually gaining entry first to be even on the ballot, in my view, is a far bigger constraint to political participation by women than just being able to actually get 80 million to deploy in a public financing. So let's go back to the math. If the math tells you that you cap presidential candidates at 4 billion, right? Expenditure. And there are 20 million voters or thereabouts. You're saying that it takes a presidential candidate close to 2,000 shillings per vote. Right? 2,000 shillings or thereabouts per vote. Is that really what it takes? is that enough to move every Kenyan to actually have their vote given out? Because I'm not too sure that using 2,000 shillings in terms of vote, planning a secretariat, and the kind of things that they go in, leaves enough money to actually have us have people wake up at 3 o'clock to cast, because it means a presidential candidate will need at least 10 million and above to be able to win. So the point for me is we must not mistake the forest for the trees. And the problem Kenyan politics and funding becomes a problem is because we have a big dysfunction around managing corruption among people who come to the public sector. So all those disclosures that everybody makes, they go to the requirements actually, which look sensible. You have to get a certificate of good conduct and everything else. If a person is able to pass that, then I shouldn't be worried that whoever is funding him, he will start to be corrupt if he's been a good person, that he'll start to be corrupt just because he's facing an election up there. So these sums, all factors considered, are actually trivial sums. So our problem is managing the integrity of systems in terms of oversight, but also around disclosures and following the money, the sources, all the way to the expenditure. So whether an elections cap exists or not, in my view, the average Kenyan doesn't lose much. And if you're talking about women, and I think we need to bring many more women here, I would think the affirmative action program, which we failed to do, is actually a far bigger constraint than how much money we cap up here. Thanks.
Thank you. You seem to say that really even this money is not enough. So let's look where it is coming from. Let's look at where it is coming from and how one will account for it. But then, Sheila, so we already have an act, and we already have some regulations, and we already have some some regulations and capping and all that. So I was saying, let me just start it off, that on the one hand, there's the law and the capping, and there are the issues that Dr. Sadotte has brought to the fore, why the capping would seem to be important. On the other hand, Kwame seems to think, maybe the capping is there, but more so, the most important thing is the source of the funding. The source of the funding, and to just limit either corrupt issues, money laundering, and that kind of monies that we really don't know where it is coming from, and that there are people who are philanthropic enough. I think yesterday we were asked even to be able to contribute to politics in this country. But what I want to ask you, how do we, as TI and the other organizations that are here, how do we ensure that the law is there, that it is implemented, that we can monitor and make sure that actually, as the law is there, because we put up the law as Kenyans, and we decided we wanted capping. So now it is there, we have to live with it. So how do we ensure that really it is implemented? How are organizations like TI and others going out to ensure that the sources of funds, which will seem to be a big issue, the elephant in the room, the sources of funds do not include corruption funds, do not include the use of government resources, because actually what Kwame was saying, sometimes even government resources are used, not in money form, but in cars or fuel and stuff like that. So how will TI and other organizations, I don't know whether you are prepared or what strategies you're put in place to ensure that
As Dr. Sadotte had aptly said, that since 2013 we have deferred the implementation, and there's a risk that even in 2022 we'll not have it implemented. And for us, this is key. So I actually stand on the opposite side of Kwame from what he said, but very interesting perspectives, Kwame. But allow me to dispute, because as much as we have talked about the spending limits, that's what has been in the limelight. That's what ABC attempted to gazette 2 weeks ago. But when you look at the regulations, which have been sitting in Parliament since 2016, they actually touch on a number of issues that you have touched on, including disclosures on who are the sources of campaign or funding to political candidates, how much are they disclosing, how much are they funding, and how, even importantly, is how this money is being spent. So the regulations actually are covering some of the issues that you have raised, while the spending limits, whatever was gazetted by IBC 2 weeks ago, may just be looking at limits. But when you look at the regulations, it speaks to other critical aspects that need to be regulated in regard to campaign funding. And that's why for us, we are happy that IBC made that step to gazette, and we believe that IBC should move ahead to enforce, because looking at Article 88 of the Constitution, where the electoral management body is mandated and expected, required to regulate spending, and also Section 12 of the Elections Campaign Finance Act also requires them to put in place limits in terms of campaign funding. We believe that they should then go ahead. That does not even need them to go to Parliament. And Parliament, I know, attempted to nullify the gazettement of the spending limits, and also the regulations that IBC had presented in 2016, and which it resubmitted in July, and then again at some point earlier this month again. But even as much as the limits IBC should proceed in terms of enforcing those limits, we are still talking to Parliament and asking them that please, in the public interest, consider these regulations. They have said that due to issues around time lapses, but that's always the case. In fact, I think we are in trouble as a country. We really need to look at how we are going to enforce certain issues regarding accountability if we always have to go through Parliament. Because if you look at the issues around campaign funding, if you look at the issues around the two-third gender principle, there's a question again on academic qualifications. Everything grinds to a halt at the doorstep of Parliament. So we really need to find a way to work through how we can still be able to enforce some of these accountability provisions, even when parliamentarians, of course, have vested political interests when it comes to passing some of these regulations and so on. So the regulations are there. They've been stuck in Parliament for some time, but now they're claiming that the IBC was time-barred. But we are appealing to them that in the public interest, and maybe also looking at the provisions of the standing orders, standing order number 210 to be specific, and even the Statutory Instruments Act, is there something that can be done to consider this regulation? So at CAM 2022, we actually have this law enforced. The other aspect is, of course, there are amendments on the Campaign Financing Act that have been sitting again in Parliament since 2020. For us, since 2013, when this law was passed, we actually started working on some amendment because we already looked at, there were some gaps, and politicians, of course, raised some issues, even in regarding how disclosures and would be enforced, monitoring and reporting of how campaign money is being used, and there were questions around what mechanisms would be used, and that really guided the amendments that were then proposed. And IBC has been championing some of those amendments since 2020, but those amendments have been sitting in Parliament, but those would also be useful in terms of ensuring that some of those questions that have been raised by politicians and others on how some of these provisions in the law would be enforced, I think the amendments would answer some of them. So we're also appealing to Parliament to look at some of those, those amendments. But for me, I think I'd also just appeal, now that we're speaking to women, we're speaking to women who are aspiring to vie in the next elections. We are speaking to women who are already sitting, particularly in Parliament, where the debate is situated. We are speaking to Kewopa, we are speaking to FIDA, which is leading the women movement, and other organizations. we need their voices on board to be able to push for some of these critical actions that need to be taken up in Parliament moving forward, particularly in regard to consideration of the regulations and also consideration of the amendments. Because when you look at, and again here I'll still dispute Kwame, that for me, from the research that we have done in regard to campaign financing from 2002, even under the Coalition of Accountable Political Financing, we found that women, young people, persons with disabilities are completely disenfranchised, of course, in the political processes. And the issue of money, their affordability for them to be able to participate marginalizes them further. Now you can imagine it's double tragedy for a woman who is young, it's triple tragedy for a woman who is young and living with disability. The moment other candidates are able to pour in dirty money, which is coming from illicit activities, arms trade, terrorism, wildlife crime, and other money laundering and other illicit crimes, and you're still expected to compete with them, that is really not fair, and that even goes against the whole principle of a free and fair election. So we're really appealing to our women folk, the women movement, to actually appeal to Parliament to do what is needed to pass these regulations and ensure that come 2022 we actually have this law fully enforced.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Now, for us, it seems we're still in that deadlock. We're appealing to Parliament to do for us certain things to ensure the law actually comes out, the regulations come out, the amendments come out that will make this financing implemented. Now, my friend Mule, with all these challenges that we are seeing, and you do a lot of monitoring of elections, and I believe you, with the law in place right now, and we're saying it's 2022, it doesn't matter, the Constitution is there, you will be, hopefully, because I want you to confirm, you will be actually be monitoring the expenditure. And it's not enough just to implement. What do we do with those results? Do we have some strategies to move the results forward to something else? Because I would ask the question, so what? So you did the monitoring, so you found this is happening, then what? What should Kenyans do? And what strategies do you have in place to move forward the results that you get from that monitoring?
Well, thank you very much. First, to answer your question, yes, we plan to monitor the money which is going to be used in the coming elections. I think we're already working something with the TI already in terms of trying to come up with a framework in which we can be able to monitor the environment. As Dr. Sadotte has said, the law is already operational. We're talking about regulation when it comes to Parliament, but the truth is that the Constitution has already given the mandate to IEBC. So our expectation is that IEBC will be very strong in ensuring that they do regulate whatever mechanism they'll use. As soon as they're fully constituted, they should be able now to make some policy decisions in terms of how they would want to go forward in the matter to do with the regulation of campaign financing. But yes, as monitors, we will be monitoring. And what do we do with the results? The idea at the moment, one of the things that from a citizen point of view, which is important to be able to point out is that, and it was articulated very well again by Dr. Sadotte in terms of that you want an even playing field. We have a democracy in this country which should allow for every person in this country to participate either as a voter or as a candidate. If you hear the kind of monies that we're talking about, and Professor Karuti Kanyinga and TI, Mzalendo, a number of civil society organizations did a research recently. And I think that was discussed even yesterday in terms of the amounts of money we're looking for per person. And by the way, from that research, just to counter something that Kwame has said in terms of the probability of the people who are spending more money winning, according to that study, it says they are the ones who are winning. The ones who are spending more money are the ones who are winning elections. So you see, so it creates an appetite, therefore, for people to use more money. And for purposes of ordinary citizens, we need, looking at this from an egalitarian point of view, we need a field which allows everybody to be able to participate. So results and information to the public that allows them to know who is spending what, where the sources of this money are coming from, if the spending caps are going to stay, well, they've already been given by IEBC, so we expect they're going to be there. Then who breaches those particular caps? Of course, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to the question of compliance. Even if you're going to be making disclosures in respect to the monies that you're going to be using, do we really comply? Do we really give all the information? Does the IBC have the capacity? And that question, again, Kwame has brought to the fore. But for us, it's a starting point. We've had these laws since 2013. Nothing has happened so far. So we wanted IBC, and we're very happy, we're very happy that IBC went frontal on this and decided they're going to cap the limits irrespective of whether there are regulations or not. We believe that the laws which are there from the Constitution are self-executing. It's a question of IBC now putting its foot down. And from where the citizen is, it will be good for them to be able to see how much money is being spent by the different candidates, so that it invites them to participate in the process. The cost of elections in this country is very high. And we're only talking about one side of it. The topic is political financing of elections, or financing of elections, not political, which also talks about the management aspect. So we're talking about what the candidates are using, but we're also aware that there is also a lot of money which is being used in the management of elections. 2,500 shillings per voter is one of the most expensive in the world. The figures we are looking at right now, adjusted lower based on the 40.9 billion budget that Chebukati talked about, is still upwards of 1,600 shillings per voter. Still among the most expensive in Africa, and one of the most expensive in the world. So money in election is a major issue in my view, and from a citizen point of view, it is important that we have a level playing field as far as money is concerned.
Thank you very much. Before I open, I just want to throw this. You'll answer as you answer the questions from the participants. If you look at the memo from IBC, which is dated 2nd July, it says that the Act requires all political parties and candidates contesting in the 2022 elections at least 2 months before the general elections open campaign financing accounts, establish campaign financing expenditure committees, and appoint authorized persons who will manage the campaign funds. We know in this country, campaigns don't begin 2 months to the general elections. Actually, they begin way before. They have even begun. And money is being spent. So they begin to understand. So money is being spent already. So when you have these 2 months, does it really, what does it do to that? Collins, you'll answer that question just a minute as I try and open up. Any questions from the participants in the room? And please just ask the question, and you will tell us whom you are directing the question to. Any question? Okay. We have our ED, our chair. Sorry for the meaning. Oh, I'm so sorry. From the chair of FIDA, Nancy Ikino, at least I still know your name. You'll start us off in terms of this session, just to ask questions. ED, please. I am sorry about mixing up.
Thank you very much, panelists, for that very candid discussion. I want to follow this up from yesterday, where the politicians informed us that for you to be considered by the party, there are many things you must give, but the material one is money. The question they ask is, how much are you bringing? And having had all of you, I want to speak on behalf of Wanjiku, who is listening. And actually, yesterday, one of the politicians told one of my donors, candidly on her face, that what aspirants want is not education, They know everything. They don't want advocacy. They want money, and they want goodies. Actually, she said we want sanitary towels and we want diapers. And if we take sanitary towels and diapers to most of the homes, then we are assured of the votes. I had you, Kwame, and I had her, and I had Dr. Ondote and Mule. The question I want to ask, looking at the topic and looking at what perhaps is the expectations of our participants, the topic being finance, elections, status, approaches, and strategies. Doing a SWOT analysis and saying, this is where we are now, what advice would you give our aspirants on how to finance the elections? And I don't think I agree with you, with due respect, Owino, that women don't need money. Yesterday, all we were told is that for you to get into an election, you need money. You need 50 million, as one said, you need so much money. We are where we are now. And we have about 11 months to the general elections. Our women should be on the ground. What advice do we give them? What strategies do we give them on moving on from now, even as we wait for the parliament to wake up and do the regulations, if at all it will be done? Kindly. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any question from any of the regions? No. If you could answer that, what strategies do we have to give to women? And already they ought to be on the ground. They are not on the ground because they don't have the money right now, yet others are already on the ground because they have money. So is that a level playing field? But what can they do in order to bridge that gap? So I don't know who will answer. Collins had asked a question. You had said you'd answer a question, then we can give any of you to answer that. What do the women do?
Let me answer the first question and leave Edie's more difficult question to Kwame. I will allude to it a little bit and then leave it to Kwame. I think your question about 2 months to an election, that's when the account is open, shows you, and I agree with Kwame on this issue, shows you the danger with our fixation of the Election Campaign Act. Contrary to what Mule is saying about IEBC, I think IEBC is much more innovative. I think the over-focus on following the regulations and the laws, the appeals from shame will fall on deaf ears. I can bet you Parliament will not pass the campaign finance regulations, period. We can appeal, we can pray, we can cry, they will not pass it. Because it is not in their self-interest to pass it. In the same way like education qualification, they will postpone it to the next election and they will use every excuse. Because if they wanted to, nothing stops them from reducing that period of 12 months to 8 months. Nothing stops them, but they won't do it. What does that mean for us? In my view, I think there are 2 things, and Joyce is here, that I think IEBC needs to do. Number 1, they have enough legal power to ensure that both limits and disclosures are dealt with the next elections, and they should do so. 1, the Constitution empowers them. 2, in 2016, we passed Violate an Election Offences Act. That Election Offences Act makes it an offense to treat voters. It makes an offense to give voters money, the same things that women are asking for. We actually are using money illegally and we are normalizing it. IBC can be able to hold people, and the moment you start charging people for spending money to working together with DPP, they will take you seriously. They will now go back to the regulations and say, what can we fix? So I think that's the first thing that I think requires to be done. The second thing that requires and goes to Sheila and to Mule, that's IBC must do. Even as they develop the regulations and take them to Parliament, IBC must stop sneaking things. They must start developing coalitions with civil society and with citizens. Because the implementation of this thing will require that citizens are informed and that engage in the process. It requires that you have conversations with civil society so that some of the things that are done are outside the law, the advocacy that is required. If you, for example, publish, for 10 years we've been publishing reports about who speaks most in Parliament and who speaks least. There's no law that requires that to be done. But anytime it is done, MPs complain. But if we start now publishing how much my friend Priscilla Nyokabi has spent in Nyeri to run to be MP, she will wake up and listen. And if we do that consistently, and if Mule does it, and every time it is published, IBC comes to launch and say, you know, as we're launching this report, we'll actually follow up. And the next day it is written to DBP to investigate, you will see politicians are influenced. So I think that's what requires to be done. My last issue, and I think much more for Kwame, I agree, and we require money, but I think we need to ask ourselves, as we require, if we're not innovative in terms of how we get the money, if we're looking for the same amount of money as the billionaires who are corrupt are, they will always win. So we must make a choice. I think the statement that, you know, aspirants don't require education, they just require money, I have heard it for many years. Unfortunately, I think they are wrong. First, they will not get the money, not from any donor. Two, they will still lose if that's what they're looking for. So what does it mean? Some levels of money is required, but I think two other things are required. Number one, we need to ask ourselves, all the stages in which money is used, there are some that can actually be taken away from the candidate and put to somebody else, meaning public funding of it. How can we ensure that happens? That's number one. Number two, are there some places where money is used that is actually corrupt money that we can prevent anybody from using? That helps. Then number three, for the women, are there innovative ways but we can be able to ensure that we both get the money but also do some of the things? Use of technology, for example. Use of how do we get donors to do? What is the role of some organization in terms of supporting women? You know, if we are innovative around it, then we'll be able to solve that thing. But if we just think the only solution is to get more money, we will look for it. The next election will come, we'll complain again. Thank you.
Thank you for breaking our hearts. Because when we think it's money, we want more. You're telling us there is much more than money. And I think yesterday we were given an example of which MP from Meru who didn't have money and was able to do a campaign. But for women, it's much more difficult than just that. So we need to be a bit innovative. Sheila, I could see your hand really wanting to respond, and then we'll have Kwame responding. And then we will give an opportunity again to the satellites. Yeah. If there's any question, then we will be able to answer as we wrap up.
Just briefly, I want a response to the question around the 2 months. What's the validity or use of having these expenditure committees in place? So it's actually one of the amendments that are being sought, so that all these, some of these things are streamlined, because you have 2 months for the expenditure committees. I think it's 6 months that people who are currently in public office have been, they're required to leave office within 6 months to start their campaigns. Then you also need to streamline it with when the period in which people are cleared and then now declared as candidates and the official campaign period. So there are all these timelines within the elections calendar and the various laws which need to be streamlined, and then reflected in the even when you're talking about when do we start monitoring, reporting on campaign expenditure and fundraising and so on. So that's actually one of the amendments that we have been, in fact it was the first amendment, the first gap that was actually highlighted, and now we have been following that up. So it's, again, as I said, we really need to just push those amendments so that we now we can be clear about how we move forward and have a clear mechanism. I thanks Dr. Sadotte. I think he's given us also very good suggestions. I don't agree with some of them, but there are a number of very good ones. I think those for me would be some last resorts. Should we fail, if all else fails with regard to Parliament, as I said, Parliament will not listen. But again, we have also said that we are ready to go as far as court, you know, to ensure that what is in our constitution is actually what is given to Kenyans. So for us, Parliament is not the last resort. We are just trying to exploit the mechanism that, you know, but if we don't manage there, we are ready to go to court and push it from that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something before Kwame comes in?
Okay.
Just because it's something to do with what Sadotte had talked about, but it's much more of amplifying, because I think that's you asked a question about alternative ways of trying to look for money. The future is supposed to be, we are supposed to be aiming at sanitizing our politics or sanitizing our elections. And therefore the future cannot be that we want to build on what we have been doing. If it's about making more money, looking for all these monies, the largesse of money to be able to put in our elections, that's not the way. But there are other things, apart from what Dr. had talked about. There's a question of dealing with political parties. Just not there's a public funding aspect of it, but then there's the other question of can we bring some sanity to our political parties? Because if you look at some of the studies which are being done, most of the money is actually for that party primary. Because when you go to the different zones, which have zoned off areas by political parties, once you win the political party seat, you may not require a lot of money in the general elections. So a lot of the money is being used in this idea of I'm an aspirant, I want to run in a particular party, I have to go for those nominations. So if we were to put that right, that first addresses the costs which are involved, if you make it very clear. And secondly, the question of just amplifying a point again Sadotte was making in terms of engagement by different actors, the civil society and the IEBC, but also there is also the politicians themselves. It is in their interest. Anybody who wants to run in this country, it is in their interest to try to bring this issue down in terms of the kind of cost that we're looking at, especially the new politicians, women politicians, young politicians. They should be amplifying the issue around regulation of money in this particular space. And lastly, a very serious and very robust voter education, because again, as Sadotte has said, it's an offense. Some of the things about voter bribery, that's the biggest offense we have based on our monitoring. That's the biggest offense we have in this country. Forget about violence and other things. The most commonplace offense in the country is voter bribery. But yet we accept that. And that's what politicians are saying. We want to get money so that they can be able to give handouts. That's the problem. It's a culture thing which has to go.
Thank you, Kwame.
Okay. I think it's on. Look, I think it's been cited to us that there's a claim that the probability of people who spend higher money winning is higher. We, however, have to be careful not to mistake cause and effect. This subject has been studied, and there are two things that contradict it. One, countries with campaign finance laws don't necessarily have cleaner elections in terms of limits. And two, the reason a person could actually raise more money might be because they are popular in the first place. So we should not assume that if somebody has won and spent the most money, it is because money was the primary driver. So I think with that background, we have to be careful not mistaking the cause, that money is the cause of winning. Actually, maybe you win because you're able to marshal more money, not necessarily the reverse. So I think that's an essential thing for us to bear in mind. Coming to how do we finance elections? You know that, again, countries that have campaign finance limits have two approaches. If you place a cap, what happens is people establish friendly associations which campaign for the candidate regardless of whether the candidate has money or not. So these caps that the IEBC is placing, in addition to the fact that it's arbitrary, I'd really like to find out why you think that a president should have a cap of 4 million, but a member of the National Assembly should have a cap of about 20. And it was arbitrary. I mean, it was just fished off the air. And that tells you itself that there are difficult things to do, but that doesn't mean they should be done in such a haphazard way. So how do you finance elections? My view is that elections and political representation is such an important thing that I don't know whether we are actually doing the right thing thinking that our way is actually to cap that. What we should is prevent dirty money and obligations coming from representation, from those contributions infecting public policy, which is a open governance, open transmission thing. But I fear, and I must say this with respect, I do not question people's intentions. But the thing we do in this country is we force law to do things that law should not do. And to pass a law that will be ineffective from day one is actually, it is in itself very, it should not be done unconscionably. And I think that is what would happen here.
Thank you so much. I think the panelists have taken us through a lot of education in terms of financing, the challenges we are having, and where we need to go. But one of the things that has come out from all of them is that the source of money is really, really important. Even as we cap the amount to be used, we must be really on the lookout for where the source of money is, and that is something that we must continue to challenge. Either challenge it through IEBC, challenge it in the courts, and ensure that the people who go in as elected members of whichever seat are people who are not using those spaces for self-enrichment or to enrich those who are behind them. But financing is there, and it's something that once the law is there, unfortunately, we must make sure that it is actually implemented. And then we can see how it works, even for the future. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, for people in the satellite areas, we will not be able to come back to you because of time constraints. So I want to thank you, and probably what we will do, those questions that you have, could you put them to the next panelist, even as they talk about other issues in political parties? And I'm informed that the FIDA Secretariat will take note of those questions and they'll bring them forth. I think the panelists will still be here. When we will have that moment when questions are asked, they will be able to put in an answer. So I want to say thank you very much, and thank you for actually your contribution towards this conference. Thank you.
A round of applause for each of our panelists and for our moderator, please. Thank you so very much. So many points to take on. I'll ask our panelists please to come to the front. Please bring your bags with you. Come to the front. To everyone who is in the region, I know that you're burning with questions. I've also cross-checked and confirmed that this will be part of the issues that will be addressed comprehensively in the training. And therefore, please bring these questions, the ground questions, to the training. As they take the photos and we prepare for our next panel, allow me to share something else that we have to consider. Consider the following. Consider that we are going into an election during a COVID pandemic period. It therefore means that we are likely to see, if the pandemic should continue and we have anything like the restrictions we have, we are likely to see a closing down or a restriction on crowds. How will we deal with it as we campaign? This is a question for each of you to ask yourselves as candidates. How will you campaign, or what are your campaign strategies during a pandemic when social distancing is required, when public health measures are in place, when you cannot come together in crowds? What is the plan? I just want to quickly ask, where's our hotel staff? If we can get our team to get the hotel staff so that they can sanitize real quick, that would be fantastic. So the only solution, perhaps, as has been said by Dr. Collins, is not just money. It can't be money. Otherwise, nothing changes and the elections are same old, same old. Think about those strategies and perhaps just brainstorm within the regions amongst yourselves. What other strategies should you be employing that would work in this region or in this upcoming election? We're going to go into a short musical interlude while we sanitize the stage and have it ready for our next panel, which will also be moderated by Justice Violet Mavisi, and is on the role of civil society in free and fair elections and the participation of special interest groups in the process. An interlude of music now.
Wakati wetu umefika, Wakenya msilale, vota dada katika uchaguzi, katika uongozi, wakati ni sasa. Vota dada katika uchaguzi, katika uongozi, wakati wakati ni sasa. Vuta dada, mama msilale, wakati wetu umefika.